Heartbeats. I was at a cousin's place, quiet of the morning, indulging myself in a hot, crisp brun pav slathered with golden butter. Just delicious. As the morning progressed, flat would get as busy as a bus terminus. Milkman, breadman, idli dosa fellow on Sundays, driver, a neighbor sending across birthday sweets, and numerous busybodies dropping in inquisitively to inspect the unknown visitor. But right then, it was still peaceful. Out of the blue, a crazy shriek sounded from somewhere outside. I jumped up, alarmed. My cousin shot out of his chair and ran out of the flat without a word. I made to follow him, but his wife coolly waved me down and explained. An old man in the building was prone to panic attacks. When they occurred, night or day, he came out on the landing and screamed. Any available man in the building would rush to him, give him a hug, talk to him soothingly, escort him back indoors, and sit patiently with him till it passed. The building had formed a protective cushion around him. It was just astounding. In the hurly-burly of hectic Mumbai existence, in matchbox flats, with the competing demands of crazy bosses and agitated religious and political leaders, this diverse group of people saw only a neighbor in need, and there was no dearth of helpers. They dropped whatever they were doing and stepped up to the plate. They grumbled idly, but that never stopped them from being there, taking it in turns and never needing prompting. Unexpectedly, the cramped little flat had shown its big, beating heart. Everything normal. Today, my brother smiled at me. Our mother was always after us to study hard and do well in our exams, as education was our only hope. It was a maddening refrain that ran on an everlasting loop in our home. It infuriated me, but I didn't realize the effect it was having on Tapan, my elder brother, by 9 years. Even as a young boy, Tapan was the shock absorber of our family and the man of the house, picking up all the slack that our father's absence inevitably created. And we let him, until one day he just collapsed. I assumed he was sick, like a fever or something. He'd be better soon, and everything would be back to normal again. But I think Mummy knew instinctively this was different, because she harangued him to pull himself together. The world wasn't going to stop spinning for his convenience. He needed to study hard, do well in his exams, da-da-da-da-da-da. He stopped talking, even listening. No question of going to school or doing exams. In fact, no reading, no TV, no video games. Mummy kept assuring me he'd shake it off today, or today, or today. But after 10 days, we both knew that wasn't going to happen. If he was given food, he ate. If not, he stayed hungry. He bathed and washed his clothes and remained personally fastidious. But he totally and absolutely refused to engage. He performed his old chores without looking up or speaking a word. The rest of the time, he lay motionless on his bed and stared at the wall. My darling, adored brother had just opted out. We roped in his friends, relatives, the family doctor who was wheedled into a home visit, and even the local priest. Nothing worked. In his presence, we talked very obviously of things he'd been interested in: cricket, movies, school gossip. He countered by wearing headphones to drown out our chatter. We had no idea how to reach him, so we just worried and hoped and prayed. We'd adapted around Papa's absence, and now we adapted around Tapan's. Years passed in despair. Hopelessness saturated our home like a heavy sludge, filling every corner and climbing the walls so you couldn't breathe. Tapan should have finished college, but he was still in his bedroom. I watched his shoulders stoop, his cheeks hollow out, his color fade, and his eyes become blank pools. I became withdrawn and silent myself, though not as bad as him. I turned ferociously to my studies and brought home excellent report cards, and that was what kept me sane. On the bus home from school one day, somebody slid into the seat next to me and said hello. I cannot tell you how shocked I was. I muttered a flavorless hello back and was rewarded with such a bright smile, as if the sun had snuck secretly onto that bus. She said she'd noticed me a few times, and I always looked very lost in my own world. She had a bright face and soft, kind eyes. But I'd known other people with kind eyes and kept my mouth shut tight as a steel trap, so I can't explain what happened that day. I don't even remember how it devolved, but it came tumbling out of me in a torrent. She escorted me off the bus at the correct stop, and we sat together in a corner, and I talked and talked and talked until she sent me home lest my mother would worry. It took days of overflowing like this before she spoke. She admitted she'd started out worrying about me, but now she saw that Tapan was the real concern. If he could be helped, I'd be okay. We'd all be okay. She'd built back the self-esteem and confidence of other young men, so she was optimistic for Tapan too. What she spoke of so confidently seemed impossible to me, like a miracle. But she didn't speak of miracles, only of practicalities. She called herself a rental sister, but she was really a kind of psychological counselor. The term came from Japan, and she'd liked it and adopted it because being a sister, even a rental one, gave her phenomenal access. And she needed access, as her subject of specialization was locked down people. I was just astounded that whatever Tapan was going through was common enough to have a name. She fixed it up with Mummy. She'd visit Tapan twice a week. She sat outside his door and chatted with him in her lively voice. She wrote him notes and read from books. She talked about the news or us, his family, or about her own life. Not all sunsets and roses, but just as thorny as ours. She laughed, she cried, she sat silently. She had infinite patience. He didn't accept her notes or respond to her questions or comments. Never opened the door, never stepped out in her presence, and once, when she came in as he was eating, he abandoned his unfinished meal and locked himself back into his room. She kept coming and kept talking. Week after week, month after month. She guided Mummy and me to behave normally with him, not to shield him. He had to learn to shield himself, she said. That's what she was there for, to retrain him, to cope. And so she herself spoke to him of all manner of things, including failure and hopelessness and other dark things. One day, Months after her first visit, when Mummy had made Tapan's favorite malpuas, he washed and put away his plate and stood for a long time in silence at the sink as we carried on with whatever we were doing as advised by Sister. He hesitated beside Mummy on his way back to his room, and in the now normal silence of our home, he dropped two distinct words. "Thank you." And before either of us could assimilate them, he was gone, and we heard his door click shut. His voice had sounded cracked and strange. He hadn't used it for so long. Both of us bawled, stuffing our faces into cushions so that he'd not hear us. It was so unexpected, so beyond all hope. We phoned Sister, and she was happy, but said she'd come again only as usual. We were not to initiate any contact when he next stepped out. Stay normal. There were agonizingly long, hopeful months between each step. There were retreating steps too, crushing us to despair. But the advancing steps caused hope to burgeon madly in our hearts, and we could build whole worlds on them despite Sister's every caution. She taught him breathing exercises and vocal exercises, which he did in the dead of night so he wouldn't disturb us. But I listened for them every night. Those sounds were the best lullaby in the world. They reassured me that my brother was on his way back. Somehow she nursed him and his fragile psyche back this side of the border of normal. She even got him on an online study schedule en route to making up his arrears. I wasn't that far behind Tapan now. He'd lost 5 years of his life. One day, as Sister sat chatting with him through the shut door in her usual way, he unlocked his door, and she casually pushed it open and walked in as if it was the most normal thing to do. I wept with delight for him, but was also heartbroken for myself. Why not me, his real sister? Sister admonished me. I was too precious to Tapan, and he was scared to hurt me any more than he already had. I must not lose faith in him. The logic was twisted, yet it made sense to me. The first time he stepped out of the house, it was for me, on my birthday. He was waiting at the bus stop when I returned from school. We walked home in burning silence, for no words could express the seething tangle of emotions. He let me touch his hand briefly in thanks before he walked silently into his room and shut the door. I also accepted this massive gift wordlessly. Sister said, we must act normal. She reduced her visits to only 1 a week. Mummy and I were instantly terrified. She'd been coming twice a week for years. Would he be okay? Would her absence trigger a relapse? But Tapan took it calmly, as if everything was normal. She'd known exactly when to make the cut. It's incredible to think she achieved all this only by talking. Mostly about how life was both good and bad, and one just had to sway with the punches. She accepted that he'd been broken, and she basically said that was okay. It happened. There was no shame. But he could mend himself too. She put the control of his life firmly back in his own hands and made him see that even withdrawal was a choice, a destructive one. Why not make a better choice? She got Mummy to back off on her full court press of study, 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 and she permitted me to have faith in Tapan again. She was so subtle, so soft, so gentle, yet all-pervasive, like water. She surrounded us and buoyed us up, all of us, not just Tapan, until we felt we could stay afloat ourselves. And today, my darling, adored brother looked in my eyes and offered me a small smile. And I'm crying so hard inside. I think I will die of joy and relief and the resurgence of hope. Fly, my little bird, fly. He was my father in every way that really mattered, except for being responsible for my genes. That was a burden I didn't have to place on him. In fact, he was the one who saved me from becoming a slave to my genes. I'd come here as a teenager, seeking refuge from a very bad experience. I don't want to go into it. All that's behind me. I've lived it, in fact, and in my mind for way too long. Finally, I've dealt with it and boxed it and put it away. But that wasn't the case when I came here, seeking shelter from the terrible storm in my life. The priests provided that shelter from the storm, and an atmosphere of calm and peace which slowly seeped into me. But even with all that, if it had not been for Father, I've always called him only that, I would not have made it through those dark, dark years. Slowly and with infinite patience, he healed me. He was my rock, my anchor, my refuge. His faith in me made me keep trying even when I'd rather have given up. He made me see that life and goodness were worth fighting for, that all the world was not black and evil, that there were adults who deserved respect and love. He saved me from the fiery hell of my own mind and the immeasurable pit of my own horrors. And who can ever pay enough for that kindness? I would have done anything for him, accepted any task or hardship at his behest, followed any command, except the only one thing he asked of me. His request, it was ever only a request, never a command. His request terrified me. It scared me back into my shell. I raged at him. How could he ask this of me? He who knew how badly I'd been mauled and how hard won my victory over that mauling had been. How could he ask this of me? He kept insisting he was not asking, only suggesting. Because he knew that it was really the only way to let go of the turbulent past and to walk boldly and fearlessly into the future and whatever wonders it may hold for me. I had to face my demons and conquer them, not run from them and hide here in this safe haven. If I didn't face them, they would always be there, lurking just outside these walls, or even inside. Hadn't he so easily revived them by his mere suggestion? And they'd retain their power to torment, torture, and destroy, always keeping me prisoner. The only way to overcome them was to face them, however much that scared me. Face them alone, without him at my side. Fight them and send them packing. And he'd drip, dripped that into my ears until finally the message went through and I saw the sense of his gentle words and accepted the truth of his quiet way. Life was for living, for celebrating, he said. Be sad, be joyful, be angry, but be there. This place shouldn't be more than a temporary refuge from life, unless it was a choice. It was my choice, I rushed to assure him. It was my choice, absolutely. But I could not look him in the eye, for both of us knew it was only my choice because it was safe. I didn't choose it in spite of the outside world. but because of it. And that was never going to be good enough for him, and I knew it. Even after I accepted in principle that he was right, it still took me more than a month to make myself leave. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Even when you skydive out of a plane thousands of feet above the earth, you know you have a parachute strapped to your back and that you will most likely land safely. Here, I had no such confidence. Only my terrible memories of having been savaged in the past. A very real fear that I was venturing into mortally dangerous territory, and no parachute except the coping mechanisms I'd learned from my father. And into this nightmare world, I finally gathered my courage and stepped. I was scared. I was angry, and I felt utterly let down by one who should never have let me down. I'd put this place behind me and out of my life forever. That chapter of my life was over. Ultimately, this father had betrayed me too. I put him behind me as well. I was alone, and I'd sink or swim, but I would do it myself. I had to give it my best shot. And to hell with everyone else, including all fathers. It was awful. I feared and trembled and looked over my shoulder every moment till I trained myself to live with the fear. Then I faced it. Then I overcame it. Then I almost fell into the pit myself and started to perpetrate it on others, as weak as I'd once been. But I caught myself and stayed on the bright side, just by the skin of my teeth. But I stayed there. Slowly, I began to appreciate being there, out in the world, master of my own fears, knowing that no one could harm me, nor would I harm anyone, on my own terms. It was heady. It was a rush. I didn't have much, but still my life was full. I was a rolling stone and rolled on to new and wonderful vistas all the time. But I made friends, found happiness, experienced joy, and yeah, even love. And then I began to feel the emptiness of it. I had supped full of horrors, and I had supped full of pleasures, and still I was malcontent, hollow. I lived for the moment, the next meal, the next friend, the next thrill. I took greater risks and got greater rushes, but their power to please was fleeting. I was racked with emptiness and cast about hither and thither for fulfillment. I had rejected all my past. My present was empty, and the future stretched ahead even more everlastingly empty. That's when my father's calm voice, telling me this place was a choice, not a refuge, eased its way back into my awareness. I rejected it. He had turned me out into the storm. He had not cared enough for me. I argued on both sides. He did love me. How could I doubt it? Then why had he thrown me out? He didn't throw me out. I should know better than to say something as jackass as that. And on, until I came to the acceptance that it had felt immeasurably cruel, but it had also been the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. The most faith anyone had ever shown in me. The strongest vote of confidence anyone had ever cast for me. The greatest gift anyone had ever given me. Yet, I had to climb over my ego still. Could I go back since I'd been turned away? Or should I go back to acknowledge that I'd been wrong and he'd been right? Did I want to go back to that restricted life? After all, I'd been free for decades. I scaled back my life. I reduced it to simplicity. My needs became very few. But finally, I felt replete. and I started shining. On the inside, I could feel myself glow, and soon others could see it too. They sought me out. They told me their stories. They brought me their pain. Somehow, I could spread the cloak of my internal peace over them. I never thought this would be me. And by, I knew what I must do, without which I could not go on. And that's how I find myself in front of these gates. I don't know them from the outside. They look quite different from the inside. There's a sign saying the priests are at prayer between 2 and 4 p.m. and that visitors are welcome before or after. It's 3:30 now, but I can't wait. I've already waited too long. I know the gates are never locked and I push them open and enter. I catch the air inside instantly and feel the rush of time against my soul. My stride changes. A quiet descends upon me, and my eyes automatically seek the flagstones. My feet direct me to the prayer chambers where they all sit in silent prayer, and with my eyes still downcast and my tread still calm, I pass down the lines slowly, seeking, and then there can be no mistake. The strength that had held me up so long fails me, and I fall at his hard, careworn feet, wrap my hapless body around them, and sob and sob and sob. His feet have not moved since I threw myself upon them, and are awash with my tears as he strokes my head calmly and lovingly, waiting till I have cried myself dry. I've been waiting for you, my father says. I always knew you'd come back to tell me you'd made it through your forest. Fly, my little bird, fly. A festive lunch or two. He examined his 2 decent shirts. Only half decent, actually, he acknowledged ruefully. And the white one probably didn't deserve that epithet either. The collar had seen better days too long ago. So it would have to be the brown one. Not exactly appropriate, but there wasn't any other option. His white lungi was fine. He hardly used it, keeping it only for these special occasions, so it was probably the best article of clothing he possessed. This was an important day in his calendar. As a poor priest, unaffiliated to any temple, making a living was an act of daily desperation. Luckily, he'd never married and was responsible for nobody except himself. Still, for the last 6 years, it had been a blessing to know for sure that at least on this one day of the year, he would eat well and sleep on a full belly. 7 years ago, he'd been trudging the cruel pavement as was his custom when he was stopped by a lady, evidently a maidservant, and politely asked if he would kindly grace her mistress's home with his presence. The old-fashioned speech and formal gesturing was unaccustomed music to his ears. She said her mistress wanted to feed some Brahmins to honor her late husband on his birth anniversary. Of course, he leapt at the chance. This gracious lady had invited 5 Brahmins for the lunch, which she and the maid had prepared with evident care. It included many of her late husband's favorite foods. All the men were touched by her gentility, and there was none of the usual gormandizing at such events. There were discussions about many subjects, including the absent host. At the end of the leisurely lunch, their hostess invited them to reunite a year later. She insisted that they return and that it would make both her and her husband happy. And just like that, it had become an annual ritual. The numbers at the table had steadily declined over the years. The guests went from 5 to 4 to 3 to only 2 last year, each one wondering who'd be the last man standing. The hostess too was showing signs of age and looked thinner than when they'd first met. The maid was tired and sometimes querulous with the men, though evidently devoted to her mistress. He stepped out cautiously. He was always cautious nowadays. He couldn't afford to have an accident. There was no one to look after him, nor any money to pay for the treatment. And if he fell, that would be the end of him, he knew. It was too early to go to the ritual lunch, but this was his time to go out, so he did. He was lumbering along slowly and aimlessly when he found himself almost shanghaied and herded into an outdoor banquet area. The aggressive men refused to listen to his demurrals. They had to feed a certain number of people. He was a person, sit down and eat. He didn't look as if he was in any position to be turning down a feast. He perched precariously on a misbalanced plastic chair on the patchily grassed lawn on which they'd set up their hasty trestle tables covered with lengths of graying paper and rows of banana leaves already drying and curling at the edges. A row of mangy-looking servers were coming down the line, slapping food onto the banana leaves. The rest of the diners attacked the offerings with a vigorous appetite. The aroma filling the space was powerful. Those over-hearty man-handlers had been right. He could definitely do with the food. Even the certain knowledge that there was a grand meal awaiting him in a few hours couldn't help him hold back. And when the steaming rice, flooded with golden ghee and drowned in plump vegetables, was smacked down right in front of him, he gave up all pretense of resisting and reached hungrily for the food. It slid down his scraggy throat and into the empty bowl of his stomach, from where it called for more and more and more. One of the raucous gang slapped him on his back. "What, old man? I thought you were saying no. Now I see you can't get enough, huh?" Even the cruel remarks didn't give him pause, and he nodded eagerly for a second helping of the rich and glistening halwa. His belly felt tight as a drum, and a resounding belch rolled up through it. And that's when he realized what he'd let himself do. He folded his leaf shut and pushed it away. He was disgusted with himself. But he was wedged in by 2 hefty table-mates and couldn't leave, so he sat there and wallowed in his shame. When at last he thought he could escape, he was snagged by one of the easy-breezy youngsters again, pushing a bag into his hands, roughly, though not unkindly. "There's a shirt and lungi in there, and 2,000 rupees, so don't go turning away good fortune when it drops right into your hands, old man." The brutishness of the boy stung him, more so as he compared it with the elegance of his hostess for lunch. In only 2 hours, he must present himself for another feast, and he didn't feel he could slide in a drop of anything at that moment. But he'd rather die than insult that gracious lady by refusing her food. So he walked and walked and walked for those 2 hours, clutching that bag that he didn't want but couldn't afford to give away. Tired and sweaty, he stopped at a tap and laved water over his arms and head and face. It struck him that he could wear his new shirt, and he delved into the bag and pulled out a crisp blue shirt and in a trice he'd whipped it on and pushed his wet brown one into the bag. But not before he noticed the red gift envelope and pulled it out. It wasn't sealed, and a quick glance told him there were really 2,000 rupees inside. That was more money than he could remember seeing in one place. Those youngsters had been crass and brutal, but they, or whoever they represented, had been hugely generous, he acknowledged. The maid led him into the house and escorted him to the dining room, where the other guest and the mistress of the house were already present, and they sat down to lunch straight away. He noticed she was in a wheelchair. Surely that was new. The food was already laid on the table in covered dishes. Perhaps ferrying it from the kitchen was a harder task now than previously. Everything looked a bit run down, and he had no idea if it had always been so. He realized that in the past, he'd been completely focused only on filling the hollow cavern of his belly, and it was only because he wasn't as starved as usual today that he had the leisure to observe his surroundings. He saw how the mistress herself held back and ate very little, while constantly encouraging the two of them to have more. He almost drowned in shame as he realized the offerings were limited and were being reserved for the honored guests. Or had they always been? He couldn't say. She commented that he wasn't eating with anything near his usual appetite, and he confessed, falsely, that his ability to eat had been sadly reduced of late. All the time, she urged them both to have some more of this or another of that, and all the time he observed everything far more minutely than before. She wasn't poor by any means, he understood. She had the house and the furniture and all her good quality clothes and the trimmings for her elegant table, all her old things, which she was husbanding carefully. But she must be short of ready money. The wheelchair was a homemade contraption, a plasticky thing with casters, quite insecure. But she was rail thin, and so it would serve. There was evidently no help other than the maid, who was looking frazzled with all the extra work for this elaborate lunch. His heart went out to her. She was a kindly soul and had always treated her random Brahmins with dignity. She'd never played the grande dame with them, just the generous hostess. But it was patent to him that now she had distinctly less to be generous with. When they'd been fed fit to burst, she permitted them to leave, only insisting they visit again next year and maintain the tradition to honor her husband. The other fellow thanked her and scrambled off, appreciating nothing but the warm food that now filled his belly. He himself hesitated a moment at the door before speaking to the maid. "I have been lucky recently, and as your madam has always been so generous to me, I have enclosed some of my good fortune and left it in a red envelope under my plate. Please explain to your mistress that this is a small dakshina, a token only of the immense thanks I owe her for the great kindness she has shown me year on year. I will be most honored if she will accept it." The maid's eyes flew up to his, alarmed. But when she saw nothing but his soft honesty, she relented. It would not be easy, but she would try to convince her mistress. It was only a token dakshina, he insisted, for he had learnt much from her mistress in these 7 years. He thanked the maid and walked away quietly. That red envelope would keep them for a month at least. It gave him an inordinate satisfaction. He was used to scrounging every day for survival. The riches had been surprisingly easy to give away. And he still had the new shirt and the lungi. A guffaw of laughter burst out of him as he thought that, if he was still around the next year, he'd have to go looking again for those bumptious boys and their rude generosity.